I live here in Georgia, and for the third term in a row, the Democrats have sent us a female to run for the governor of Georgia. The Democrats, for the third time, Stacy Abrams twice, and now they're sending us Kesha Lance Bottoms, the same woman that tucked her tail and ran after being mayor of Atlanta for 4 years. She could not stand the heat, so she ran to Washington to work for Joe Biden. Keep in mind, Atlanta only has a population around 500,000 people. The state of Georgia has a population around 10 to 11 million. She couldn't handle 500,000. She ran. And now she want to run for governor of Georgia? No, lady. Yeah, you're going to be the nominee for the Democrats, but you don't have a chance in hell to beat the Republican nominee. I don't care what fuck who it is.
Or a race that we wouldn't normally be getting into the nuts and bolts on, but here we are, Georgia Supreme Court, the projected winner in one of several races up in the Georgia State Supreme Court. Sarah Warren here over Jen Jordan. Warren, conservative-backed, Jordan, liberal-backed. Former President Obama endorsed Jordan, as she did not pull it out in this race. And so this is not necessarily a shocker, but it is significant because of the makeup of the state Supreme Court in Georgia. It is more conservative leaning. Obviously, when you look at some of these key battlegrounds, Georgia, Pennsylvania, among them, if there are, this is the 2028 factor, right? I mean, potentially 2026 too, but if there are questions over the next couple of years about election discrepancies or concerns, obviously, President Trump has fomented those election fraud lies previously. It in many ways may come down to these state Supreme Courts, and that is why there's such a focus on these races.
And questions about
Look, what happened in Georgia, as you guys can see on the screen, is a straight up lesson in political reality that the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about. You had a former Republican lieutenant governor, a guy named Geoff Duncan, who literally made his name by standing up to Trump's election claims in 2020. And he decided to burn every single bridge he had by switching to the Democratic Party. He went all in. He was on CNN constantly talking about how Republicans are toxic, how the party is infected with conspiracy theories, how he couldn't stomach being Republican anymore. His whole campaign was built on this idea that Democrats would embrace him as the hero Republican who finally broke ranks. He thought standing against Trump would be his golden ticket to winning a Democratic primary and becoming governor of Georgia. So what happened? Democrats rejected him completely. He got 6 points of the vote, not 6% of some smaller primary. He got 6% of the vote. 6% in a race with multiple candidates, which means he got demolished, humiliated, which means his career basically ended in one night. This is the real story nobody's talking about, and it teaches us something crucial about how voters actually think. But before we even get to Duncan's disaster, there's something bigger that the media completely buried because it doesn't fit their narrative. Georgia has Supreme Court races on this same ballot, and Republicans won both of them. Both Sarah Warren, a conservative-backed candidate, won by almost 19 points. 19 points. That's not close. That's a landslide victory against her Democratic opponent. And keep in mind that the Democratic opponent had endorsements from major figures like former President Obama. But Warren still dominated. Then you had Charles VETO, who also won his race, though he had a much tighter margin. Still won, though. And here's why this actually matters in a way that goes way beyond just 2 court seats. State Supreme Courts in Georgia state Supreme Courts in Georgia and across the country really, they control redistricting, all right? They decide how voting districts get drawn up. They also handle disputes over elections. If there's ever a question about how an election was run or whether it was legitimate, it comes down to these state courts. Democrats knew this. That's why they were pushing so hard to flip these seats. They wanted to block Republican redistricting efforts across the entire South. This was a strategic battle, not just some side race. And when Republicans actually show up and voted, we both won the races when it comes to Republicans. Sarah Warren's 19-point margin proves that when people engage, when they participate, Republicans don't lose, they win. But the media won't touch this story. You know why? Because it contradicts everything they've been saying for months. They've been pushing this narrative that Republicans are losing everything, that there's a blue wave coming, that Democrats are unstoppable. Georgia's Supreme Court races blow that narrative apart. When you look at what actually happened, when people got informed and voted, Republicans swept the races that matter for the future of the state. This is exactly why every election matters, even the ones that don't make national news. Most people don't pay attention to state Supreme Court races. They seem boring. They seem disconnected from everyday life. But these judges decide redistricting and election disputes for the next decade. That's massive. Georgia voters understood that, and they voted accordingly. The lesson here is simple. Turnout is everything. When Republicans stay engaged, when they show up, they win. But that story doesn't fit mainstream media's playbook, so they ignore it and focus on the Democratic primary instead. And that's where we need to shift our attention now, because the Democratic primary tells a different kind of story. One about weakness, about poor leadership, and about a candidate with a terrible record trying to convince people she deserves a bigger job.
The state legislature passed Senate Bill 1, known as the Riley Gaines Act of 2025. It bans transgender athletes from participating in women's and girls' sports in Georgia public schools and universities. If you were governor and that bill came to your desk, would you have signed it or vetoed it?
You know, one of the worst things Donald Trump and his MAGA sock puppets have instituted in this country is just an environment, an ecosystem of hatred. They've demonized so many different people and ways of life. One of the reasons why I stand here as a proud Democrat is I don't have an asterisk mark next to loving my neighbor. I get to wake up every day and love my neighbor as is. You know, and this issue in particular is not an issue that comes up often on the campaign trail. It's a very small portion of the population, a very fractional part but a very important part of the population. Folks are talking about the affordability crisis. They're talking about the health care crisis. They're talking about the Donald Trump crisis. That's the heat map of concerns amongst Democrats, independents, and yes, even this batch of disgusted Republicans that are showing up that are hopefully going to support us in this campaign so that a Democrat for the first time in nearly 30 years is able to win this governor's race. As governor, I would have vetoed the bill. Because at the end of the day, this bill was not about making a difference. It was about simply picking a fight and proving a point. I think at the end of the day, this conversation needs to be had in small circles, in communities, and not sitting at the legislature trying to worry about their next bail piece in a campaign.
Out front to Geoff Duncan. He's running as a Democrat in the race for Georgia governor. Now, anyone watching this show will remember Duncan. He was obviously has been on CNN many times. He was the former Republican lieutenant governor under Governor Kemp. And Duncan stood up to Trump's lies that the 2020 election was stolen. Now, Geoff, you are now running as a Democrat. So just people say, okay, look, lieutenant governor at that time, popular Republican administration, all of a sudden now a Democrat. How much does President Trump have to do with your decision to switch parties?
It's certainly part of it. I mean, the sitting president trying to steal an election as a statewide elected official like I was, certainly is part of it, but I think it's the toxic, corrosive leadership style that's spread like an infection across all Republicans in all circles. It's really just been an unfortunate series of missteps by them, and I think as I travel around the state running for governor as a proud Democrat, folks are wanting to talk about issues that Donald Trump and other Republicans aren't talking about. The affordability crisis, the health care crisis, and yes, the Donald Trump crisis, which even Republicans agree is a crisis at this point.
So you're one of the main Democratic candidates for governor in Georgia. Obviously, it's a very crowded field. We've just got early numbers coming in. Obviously, Keisha Lance Bottoms is way ahead on these early numbers, 66%. You're on the board there. Trump has called you out as a failed former lieutenant governor. He's called you a total lightweight. He's called you a total loser, all of which is obviously consistent with words he uses to describe opponents or people who've challenged him. Has that helped you out at all in this race?
Yeah, everywhere I go, I get, pats on the back, thanks for your courage to stand up to Donald Trump. And the reality is almost everybody that I meet would have done exactly the same thing. Most people don't wake up wanting to tell bold-faced lies about an election or try to steal an election or be willing to embrace conspiracy theories that make no sense. And so that's certainly been part of the story. But I think it's also about we all need to have more political courage in this tough moment. I mean, Donald Trump is the worst decision this country's ever made. And even Republicans are figuring that out firsthand. And so we've got to have honest umpires that show up and be able to call balls and strikes, right? In Georgia, expanding Medicaid is a must. Republicans have lost the narrative. I was on the other side of this argument for a number of years, and I was wrong. The same with affordability crisis. We can no longer demonize poverty. We've got to figure out ways and solutions to wrap our hands around folks that are in need of help. And the list goes on and on and on. Look, Donald Trump is not making a decision that helps a single Georgian, no matter what your political party is.
So that's Geoff Duncan. So let's talk about why Duncan's collapse tells us something deeper about how politics actually works. Because his story isn't just about a guy who made a bad career move. It's about what happens when a politician tries to build a whole identity on being against something instead of being for something. Duncan's entire strategy was built on one thing. Trump is bad. Republicans embrace Trump. Therefore, I'm leaving Republicans. That was literally his pitch. He went around telling anyone who would listen that he couldn't stay in a party that had become infected with conspiracy theories and corruption. He talked about how Republicans had lost their way and how they become toxic. How he was the principal guy willing to break ranks and say no to all of it. And yeah, some Democrats ate that up at first. The idea of a Republican defector, a guy from inside the party saying it's all broken, that's catnip for certain audiences. But here's the thing that exposes everything. When you get past the Trump rhetoric and ask Duncan an actual policy question about what he believes, the whole act falls apart. During the primary, someone asked him directly if he were governor and a bill came to his desk banning biological males from competing in girls' sports, would you sign it or veto it? This isn't some obscure thing. This is a mainstream policy question that most voters have a clear opinion on. It's about fairness in sports, about protecting opportunities for girls. Majority will say about what you actually think is right or wrong. So how did Duncan answer? He completely pivoted. Instead of giving his actual position, he went right back to the talking about Trump creating an ecosystem of hatred, instead of answering the question about fairness in sports, about demonizing people, and about how he wakes up every day loving his neighbors, as you guys heard in this clip. He made it about Trump and bigotry instead of just answering the question. And that single moment told you everything you need to know. If Duncan was actually a Democrat because of his principles, he would have answered that question like he believed it. He would have said yes or no and explained why. But he couldn't do that because his switch to the Democratic Party wasn't about principle. It was about chasing power. He was trying to become the kind of Democrat that appeals to a specific voting coalition, and that coalition didn't want him answering direct policy questions with direct answers. They wanted him performing the role of the principal Republican defector, the guy who left because the other side is evil. The moment he stepped outside the performance and had to actually say what he believed about a real policy, you could see the seams. His actual answer wasn't a Democratic answer. It was a non-answer designed to appeal to Democratic voters without committing to what Democrats actually stand for. And voters saw that. They understood that Duncan wasn't there because he believed in Democratic policies or had thought deeply about what he wanted to do as governor. He was there because being anti-Trump had become his brand, his ticket to power, his whole identity. Once he switched parties and realized that wasn't enough, that Democrats wanted him to actually stand for something, he got exposed. The lesson here is brutal but simple. You can't fake authenticity. Voters can smell when you're performing a role instead of actually believing in something. Duncan thought his anti-Trump credentials could carry him to victory, that Democrats would be so excited to have a Republican defector that they wouldn't care about his actual record or his actual beliefs. And what he learned the hard way is that voters aren't stupid. They know the difference between standing for something and standing against something. And when you abandon your original party and your original beliefs, you don't automatically gain credibility with the other side. You lose credibility with everyone. Republicans think you're a traitor. Democrats think you're a fraud. And that's exactly what happened to Duncan. He got 6% because both sides rejected him. Republicans for leaving, Democrats for obviously being fake. Obviously, and the entire exercise proved that power chasing doesn't work when voters get a clear look at the mechanism. That's the real story of his collapse. And it's about to get worse for Democrats because the person who actually won the primary has her own serious problems. So let's check this out.
Got a projection to make an interesting one. This is in Georgia in the primary, Democratic primary for governor. The projected winner, Kesha Lance Bottoms. And here's what's interesting. This is not a runoff, folks. This is a 50+1 state, handily defeating her opponents in this race, including Geoff Duncan there. We had spoken with Mike Thurmond earlier in the program, 100 hours ago now, it seems like, who had felt, I think, confident about where he was. But obviously, it is Kesha Lance Bottoms who will move on in a race against either Trump-backed Burt Jones, Rick Jackson, who spent a ton of money in the state of Georgia. Very interesting here, given the makeup of this race and the makeup of this state, too, which hasn't had a Democratic governor in almost 30 years.
To clear the 50% threshold.
That's what I mean, yeah.
With that many candidates?
But that was the question. Yeah. If there was suspense, there was some suspense, obviously, around this race generally, but also runoff or not. I think that was, in many ways, the question here.
But I think it's significant because she's obviously the former mayor of Atlanta.
That's right.
So
that's right.
There was a sense that she was going to do
name
well.
recognition.
She was the front runner. I interviewed former Lieutenant Governor Geoff Duncan, who switched parties, by the way, from Republican to Democrat. As you and I have been talking about, the Trump factor has hung over this race because that's part of why he switched parties. And he was confident he was going to a runoff. And yet in these closing days, his path looked increasingly challenging. Let's go to Steve Kornacki. Steve, can you break down a little bit of how Kesha Lance Bottoms won outright tonight?
Yeah, well, I mean, overwhelming is the short answer. Let me just get the Democratic primary called up here. Where did I press? There it is.
You got it. We're there.
It's a pretty simple story when the shade of blue we've assigned to Kesha Lance Bottoms is the shade of blue in every single county that's reported tonight. I think you're talking about it. The suspense that was coming into this was there was some chatter that there was some concern among Democrats that Bottoms, given her record as mayor of Atlanta, role with the Biden administration, might be a vulnerable candidate in the general.
So there you have it, right? Now, Kesha Lance Bottoms actually won the Democratic primary outright. She crossed the 50% threshold on election night, which means no runoff, no second run, no chance for anybody else to catch up. She won it clean in the field with multiple candidates competing for the nomination. Why? The answer is simple, but also deeply revealing about how Democrat politics works. She had name recognition. She was the former mayor of Atlanta, which is the biggest city in Georgia, which means voters at least know who she was. That's it. That's the entire explanation. But here's where this gets interesting and honestly kind of dark. Name recognition doesn't mean competence. It doesn't mean you actually did a good job. It doesn't mean you're qualified to run an entire state when you couldn't manage a single city. And that's exactly the problem with Bottoms' record as mayor of Atlanta. During her time in office, the city faced a massive surge in violent crime. We're not talking about a small increase. We're talking about homicides hitting the highest level in 20 years. That's not some abstract statistic. That means families were burying their kids at rates Georgia hadn't seen in 2 decades. And yes, crime went up across the county during that period. That's true. But Atlanta didn't just go up with the national average. Atlanta got hit hard, really hard. On top of the violence, you had police walkouts. You had mass protests. You had national scrutiny and attention focused on Atlanta's public safety crisis, especially after 2020 when the city became a flashpoint for larger debates about police and protests. Bottoms, as mayor, was supposed to manage all of that. She was the leader responsible for keeping the city safe and handling a crisis. So what did she do? She talked a tough game sometimes. But when you look at her actual record, her actual results, she was fundamentally weak on delivering public safety. When someone pressed her during interviews about what she might have handled wrong, what she might have done differently, she didn't own any of it. Instead, she blamed COVID. She blamed the pandemic for the crime spike. Look, COVID happened everywhere, okay? It affected every city in America. But somehow, other mayors managed their crime problems better than Bottoms managed Atlanta's. That deflection showed you everything. She wasn't interested in accountability. She was interested in excuses. She did give police and firefighters some pay raises, which sounds good on paper. Historic raises, she called them. But here's the thing. Money doesn't fix a broken system by itself. You can give people raises and still have chaos if you don't actually have a strategy for public safety. If you don't have leadership that enforces standards, if you don't have a clear vision for what you're trying to accomplish, Bottoms had raises but no results. Then what happened? She basically abandoned Atlanta. She left a city she couldn't manage to go work for the Biden administration at the federal level. Think about that timeline. She faced a crisis, she didn't solve it, and then she got out. Moved up to a bigger job and left a mess behind for someone else to deal with it. Now, Democrats are putting her up as the candidate for the governor of the entire state of Georgia. The candidate for the governor of the entire state of Georgia. The entire state. A woman who wouldn't handle 500,000 people is now supposed to manage a state of 10 to 11 million. But here's where the real pattern emerges that should alarm everyone paying attention. This is the 3rd time in a row that Democrats have sent a female candidate to run for governor of Georgia. They tried Stacy Abrams twice. Both times they lost. Now they're running Bottoms, who has an even worse track record on the actual issues of Georgia voters care about. Georgians want affordability. They want health care. They want public safety. Bottoms' record shows she couldn't deliver on any of those when she had the chance in Atlanta. So why does anyone think she'll suddenly be able to deliver on them statewide? The pattern isn't about learning from failure. It's about repeating it. Right? And I want you guys to check out this clip in regards to the matter, and you make of it what you may, just to add some context to the matter of the type of characteristic and character of the leader that is running.
The state legislature.
Of the leader that is running.
If you want change in America, go and register to vote. Show up at the polls on June 9th. Do it in November. That is the change we need in this country. You are disgracing our city. You are disgracing the life of George Floyd and every other person who has been killed in this country. We are better than this. We're better than this as a city. We are better than this as a country. Go home.
We're seeing this disturbing spike in crime. It's happening across the country, but it is definitely happening in your city. Homicides at the highest level in 20 years. And we're going into a summer hot weekend. It could be very bad. What are you doing about it?
We are doing every single thing that we can do about it. Just yesterday, I had a briefing from the special assistant in charge with the FBI. We are looking for outside support and resources, working with all of our partners. But you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, this is a spike that we're not just seeing in Atlanta. We are seeing it across the country. I'm talking to mayors in major cities, in cities really big and small. And we are all grappling with the same issues. In Atlanta specifically, we have really put a push towards getting our young people to work this summer.
And then as mayor of Atlanta, Atlanta did face a surge in violent crime, mass protests, police walkouts, and national scrutiny after 2020. Republicans already say that, quote, you lost control of the city. And now looking back, what do you believe you handled wrong, if you think you did handle some things wrong? And why should voters trust you now to manage the entire state?
Yeah, that's a convenient narrative. What we know is that during COVID, cities across this state and across this country saw an increase in crime. But many of the programs and initiatives that I pushed for while I was mayor are beginning to pay off in cities across this country. Specifically, my first visit to the Oval Office, while we were talking about getting vaccines out and distributed, I joined governors and a few mayors from across the country. I asked at that time that cities be given flexibility with funding coming out of Washington, D.C., COVID funding that we could put toward public safety. As mayor, I gave our police officers and our firefighters historic pay raises, the largest that they had ever seen.
Critics have been very critical about when it comes to this quote unquote flexible COVID funding during COVID, because a lot of blue states seem to have come across a lot of issues of fraud and mismanagement when it comes to monies, because so much of the COVID money that eventually ran out, not able to basically manage the checks and balances of their original budget. And now that the money has ran out that they got spoiled on and basically splurged it on whatever they want, now they're basically dealing with budget deficits, specifically in the school system. The bigger picture here is straightforward. This Georgia primary reveals something the mainstream media desperately doesn't want you to notice. You had three major stories come out of that election night. First, Republicans swept the state Supreme Court races when the electorate actually showed up. Second, the Democratic primary exposed massive internal weakness because of their anti-Trump defector, I should say. That's where the internal weakness came from. It got crushed from the anti-Trump defector, such as Geoff Duncan. And their winner is someone with a documented failure record that I just showed you guys in this clip. And not to mention, on top of that, to add the icing on the cake, that the layer of, it happened to be her talking about the flexing spending as she was in the Oval Office for COVID monies, which has been highly known for critics, has been saying a lot across the board. Not saying that either Republican or Democrat, because there is fraud that's happening in Republican states too, but primarily more so Democratic states, aka blue states, are basically the one that has mismanaged these COVID monies in the name of fraud more often. But third, the whole thing demonstrates that the narrative of inevitable Democratic dominance is completely false. The media has been hammering in the same message for months. Republicans are finished. The blue wave is coming. Democracy is being saved by Democratic voters. Georgia just proved that story doesn't hold up when you actually look at what happened. In the Supreme Court, races matter because they control redistricting and election disputes for the next decade. That's not some abstract political game. That's real power that affects real outcomes. Democrats understood the stakes and went all in trying to flip those seats. They lost. Republicans won. And when you look at the gubernatorial primary, you see weaknesses everywhere. Duncan couldn't even get to double digits because his entire candidacy was built on opposition of Trump rather than anything constructive. Bottoms won because of name recognition, despite a track record of failure on the exact issues that matter most to Georgia voters. There's no strength there. There's no momentum. There's just a coalition selecting the option that was least bad, not the option that was actually good. Georgia sits at a critical battleground headed into 2024, 2026, and beyond. It's not some throwaway state you check in on occasionally, is my point. This is where national power gets decided. The Supreme Court composition matters because this is exactly the kind of state where election disputes might end up in court. The gubernatorial race matters because the governor sets a direction for the entire state apparatus. Every position matters because they compound. You can't just focus on the presidency. You can't just pay attention when national media decides something is newsworthy. Georgia showed voters who understand that the machinery of government is built from the ground up. They understand that engagement at every level produces actual consequences. The fundamental accountability lesson here is hard to ignore if you're paying attention. When voters show up, they reject both the politicians who abandon their roots chasing power and the politicians with weak records on the fundamentals. They're not fooled by anti-Trump rhetoric. They're not impressed by someone escaping a city they couldn't manage. They want leaders who produce results. The media won't emphasize this because the story contradicts their favorite narrative. But if you watch what actually happened in Georgia, you saw voters making clear choices about accountability and competence. So the election cycle proves voters are watching and making informed decisions about who deserves power, whether it's a Republican jumping ship or a Democrat with a failing track record. People reject weakness in obvious self-dealing. Georgia demonstrates what accountability looks like when citizens actually participate. The message is clear. Show up, vote, and hold everyone responsible for results. Drop a comment on what you think this primary says about November's general election. Subscribe for the analysis mainstream outlets won't touch because it breaks their talking points. That is what real accountability looks like. Spread that peace, love, and positivity. Let the love supersede the hate. And as always, family, I'll catch you in the next one. And give this video a big thumbs up. Peace.